Good afternoon. Welcome to this presentation on behalf of the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership. My name is Ellen Anderson, and this presentation is called How Land Is Appraised, Appraisal Basics for Landowners. I'm glad you could be here with us today. We are a safe distance apart on a lovely day in April, and we'd hope to be with you in person, but that's not going to work out. So we will do the best we can to give you a presentation that gives you an idea as to what to expect if you wish to protect your land and you wish to use an appraiser. So my name is Ellen Anderson, and I'm a certified general real estate appraiser in Massachusetts. I have been doing this for 25 years. And prior to that, I worked for public agencies whose job it was to protect land. Prior to that, I taught at a couple of colleges in Massachusetts, and I taught philosophy. So for most of my adult life, I've been thinking about value. So today we're talking about the value of your land. And I believe that your land, to you, has all kinds of different values. It probably has recreational value, aesthetic value. You probably believe that it's beautiful. But when you come to me as an appraiser, you are looking for market value. And market value has a very specific definition. This is the definition that is used by the Internal Revenue Service and that will likely be used by the appraiser that values your land. So we're looking for market value, and it has to be an economic value. It has to be something that you can exchange for cash. The most probable price which a property would bring in a competitive and open market under all conditions requisite to a fair sale, the buyer and seller each acting prudently and knowledgeably and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimulus. Implicit in this definition is the consummation of a sale as of a specified date and the passing of title from seller to buyer under conditions whereby, first, buyer and seller are typically motivated. Second, both parties are well informed or well advised and acting in what they consider to be their best interests. Third, a reasonable time is allowed for exposure in the open market. Fourth, a payment is made in terms of cash in US dollars or in terms of financial arrangements comparable thereto, and the price represents the normal consideration for the property sold unaffected by special or creative financing or sales concessions granted by anyone associated with the sale. And by the way, the agency or the land trust that's trying to protect your land, they're looking at all kinds of different values. And the things that you consider valuable about your land are the things that make them want to protect it. When I do an appraisal, though, the first thing that I have to ask you is, why do you want me to do this appraisal? What's the purpose of the appraisal, and who will be using it? And we have to answer those questions first. The purpose of the appraisal is likely to be, in this scenario, for conservation. The second thing that I'll want to know is what factual information is available to help me understand your land. And what do we know for sure about your land, and what assumptions do we have to make about it? So the best thing that you can do to help me or to help the land trust is to get your deeds together, get your property record card from the assessors, and any other information that you might have, such as a forest management plan, any documents that help us in a factual sense to understand your property. Once we have all that together, then the most important thing that we have to decide upon, and this is probably the key concept for an appraiser, is highest and best use. So this is highest and best use analysis. The first thing that we need to know is what is legally permissible. What can you legally do with your land? To understand that, we have to look at the zoning that applies to your land, and also we have to look at the deed to your land. Are there any restrictions in your deed already that allow somebody else to use your land, that prevent you from using it in a certain way? So we look at your deed, we look at the plans, and we look at your local zoning. The second question that we have to answer is what is physically possible? So if your land is mostly underwater, clearly you can't build a house on it. If it's a very steep hillside, clearly you have some restrictions that you might not have if your land were flat. So we have to look at all those physical qualities of your land that make certain uses more physically possible and that rule out some uses as physically impossible. Third, we have to ask what is financially feasible. So if you have a beautiful house lot in a community where nobody buys houses or builds houses, which is very unlikely, but obviously residential use would not be financially feasible. In the same way, if you have a large piece of land where you could hypothetically, physically, and legally put 100 houses, and this town only sells perhaps 10 house lots a year, then perhaps a very intense level of development, even though it's legally permissible, even though it's physically possible, it will turn out to be financially unfeasible. Now, of course, there may be many things that are legal, physically possible, financially feasible, and then we have to compare them to each other. And we have to decide what gives you the highest return to the land. And once we've answered all those questions, we have determined the highest and best use of your property. Okay, we've talked about highest and best use. Now we're going to talk about the final step, where the appraiser estimates the value of your property. What we have to do is find other properties that have sold recently, and of course we'll have to figure out what that time frame is. It depends. But we'll figure out certain properties that have sold recently whose highest and best use is similar to the highest and best use of your property. So if your property has as a highest and best use 2 or 3 house lots, we'll try to find some other land where 2 or 3 house lots could be produced. And we'll look back, usually we can look back a couple of years if the market is stable. And we do need to talk about market conditions in a minute. But right now, as of the end of March, the beginning of April, if we look back over the past few years in central Massachusetts, North Quabbin region, values have been pretty stable. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but right now we have good sales. We gather those sales together, we pick out the ones that are most comparable, we put them on a chart, we write quite a bit about them. In other words, you're going to get something that looks a little bit like a book, or at least a big fat magazine, and it's going to have descriptions of other properties that are similar to yours, and then a chart that adjusts them for the differences. So we adjust all of those sales and compare them to your property to support our estimate of value. And then we have your value. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the mechanics of actually doing an appraisal, should you choose to go forward. First of all, most of you are probably used to seeing appraisers for mortgage purposes. They come to your house, they fill out a form, and then the bank says, yes, we can give you a mortgage, or no, we can't. That's not what we're looking at here. First of all, in order to do an appraisal for land protection purposes, you're going to have a certified general real estate appraiser. There are not too many of them in Massachusetts, although if you go to the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition website, they do have a list of appraisers who are familiar with conservation work, and many of them are qualified IRS appraisers. So the appraiser you'll talk to the appraiser and give them as much information as you can, and then they will give you a proposal as to how much your project will cost. You'll get something, as I said earlier, that looks something like a very thick magazine or a small book. That's called a full narrative report. It has all of the factual data, the market data, written out so that you'll be able to understand it. It has good documentation of the sales that are compared to your property. But it's an extensive document. Most appraisers are busy, so it may take you as much as 60 to 90 days to actually get your appraisal finished. If you're working with the federal government, you may have a review appraiser who has to be selected, and the review appraiser will have to work with your appraiser. That takes time. So this is a time-consuming process. I'm sure you're concerned about how much your appraisal will cost. So you're used to paying about $500 or $600 for a residential form report. You're probably talking thousands of dollars for a qualified narrative report from a certified general real estate appraiser. And so how much exactly it costs will have to be worked out between you and the appraiser. And it depends really on how complicated your project is and how much time the appraiser has, how fast it has to get done. So the terms are negotiable, but we're definitely talking a minimum of $2,000 and up. Now, the big question in all of this is, what are we going to do starting in April 2020? So I'd like to talk about that next, and in talking about that, I'll be able to bring up and describe how a conservation restriction works and how all of these concepts sort of tie together, and what an interesting time this is. For the past 70 years, real estate has always grown, and even through the worst recessions, it's always bounced back in central Massachusetts and throughout Massachusetts generally. Now we're in a new state of affairs where it appears that the economy is not growing, and that in fact it is degrowing. We don't know how long this will be, and we can't really make any assumptions. If I tell you, don't listen to me. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that it teaches us something very important about appraisals, and that is that they are always as of a specific date. Appraisers are analysts of past activity. We are not fortune tellers, although we would like to be. And past values have always given us a pretty good idea of what future values would be, because the future has pretty much resembled the past. Do we have a discontinuity here? We do not know. We do not know. What we have is individuals losing jobs, small businesses losing customers, towns that can't print money, states that can't print money, federal government that can print money and perhaps will raise asset prices. We have financial institutions that have always supported the real estate market. We don't know how they will fare through all of this. We have local and foreign investors, especially buyers of bonds, and we have currency exchanges. All of those things have to work together properly in order to make a stable real estate market. So that brings me actually to the concept of a conservation restriction and how changes in highest and best uses may bring about changes in conservation appraisals and conservation values. Conservation restrictions. The ability to do a conservation restriction effectively may change if the market changes the highest and best uses of some properties. Conservation restrictions have traditionally relied upon the fact that the highest and best use for most vacant land is for residential purposes. And vacant land, usually, if it can be used for residential development, it supports a fairly high price per acre. On the other hand, land that cannot be used for residential development, either because it has some physical or legal limitation, or land that has a conservation restriction placed upon it, does not have such a high value per acre. For example, suppose you have a 20-acre parcel of land, and its highest and best use is for 2 lots, and each lot would sell for $100,000. That means you have a $200,000 parcel of land, or $10,000 an acre. Now suppose you put a conservation restriction on it, and you remove the right to build houses. And suppose that that conservation restriction allows you only to do non-commercial recreational things. So perhaps then your land is only worth $1,000 an acre, which means that it's worth $20,000. So you have a difference between $200,000 and $20,000. You have damages to your property of $180,000. Now suppose that as a result of degrowth, the value of agricultural land goes up because everybody wants to plant crops and nobody wants to build houses. Conservation restrictions can still be used, but they'll be different. So one of the things that what's going on now makes us wonder is, are we going to get a change in highest and best use of some land? We don't know. Secondly, are we going to have a real stop in the real estate market? Is there going to be a time when people won't be buying or selling anything, either because appraisers can't come out and meet with you, which it is now, or because they can't go into houses, or because the banks don't have the money to loan? So that could happen. If that's all that happens, then it's probably going to be temporary. But again, I'm not a fortune teller, so don't necessarily believe me. Furthermore, the states and the federal government, they need tax revenues in order to support conservation purchases. And we don't know how their revenues are going to go. We just don't know. I think in Massachusetts, our community and our state has been wonderful in preserving land and in understanding the importance between of public health and conservation, and food production and conservation. And so I think in the end we'll be doing some very good conservation work together, but there may be a time when it will be difficult, and you may want to check back in with us in a couple of months. Thank you very much.